It wasn't all a bad dream for the Tories. This morning, Liz Truss gives her version of what really happened.
Liz Truss, do you still think your economic plan was right? Got anything to say?
She's back. Liz Truss has picked up her pen and given her version of events, blaming her party, even the public, and the left-wing economic establishment, who she claims didn't give her a realistic chance. There's no sorry, but surprise that her mandate from members wasn't enough.
How many people voted for your plan? What do you mean by that?
Well, he's been talking to old friends at home and away.
Give the Ukrainians the tools to finish the job. Give them the planes.
But the musings of his predecessors might be the least of Rishi Sunak's worries, with bullying claims against his deputy.
How would he feel if one of his friends or relatives was being forced to work for a bully?
While he can't even figure out what he believes in, we'll keep delivering for Britain.
Massive strikes this week and more next.
Let's not pay the bill! Let's not pay the bill!
With no sign of budging on any side.
We need the government to come to the table and solve this dispute.
We have one big question this morning. Can the Tories just get on with governing and get along? Grant Shapps served for all of 6 days as Liz Truss's Home Secretary, and now he's Business Secretary under Rishi Sunak, and he joins us. Sharon Graham is the head of the Unite Union, who will lead her members to the picket line tomorrow in the biggest strike in the health service to date. She joins us too. And in the last of our run of leader interviews, the man in charge of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey, is here. And unless you've been on another planet, you'll have noticed that Liverpool is getting ready to host Eurovision on behalf of Ukraine. I've been talking to the Ukrainian host, Timur Miroshnichenko, about broadcasting from bunkers.
We had to go underground to do our job. All of our channels in the bunkers.
And we have a panel packed with insight to help us along this morning. Dame Kate Bingham, you'll remember her from when she was the head of the Vaccine Task Force. Sir Jake Berry, former Conservative Party chair. And Liz Kendall, the Labour frontbencher who knows all about social care. Hello and thank you for joining us on the day of one of the biggest TV events on a Sunday for years. Not us, Happy Valley, of course, but it's a determined woman in real life who's making the news this morning. The former Prime Minister, Liz Truss, who has said in the Sunday Telegraph, who get the scoop of her version of events, she admits she might have done a better job at communicating, but there is a long list of others she names at fault for the implosion of her government. She points the finger at her predecessors, saying, for years, we Conservatives have failed and have worried too much about the Labour Party. And she seems to have a pop at just about everyone else, including the wider public. She says the wider public sphere were unfamiliar with key arguments on tax and the economy, the things she was trying to talk about. On the other front page is a variety of stories. You can see the Sunday Telegraph scoop there on the front again. But the Observer says there's zero chance the Tories will keep their promise to build 40 new hospitals. The Sunday Times talks about Rishi Sunak's threat to pull the UK out of the European Convention on Human Rights. Of course, that's to do with the policy of small boats and people coming to our shores. And a variety of stories on the front pages of the different tabloid newspapers this morning. So there's a lot around. But as far as politics goes, one big story. Now, Jake Berry, you were the chair under Liz Truss's government. You tried to hold it all together. But this morning we have her pointing that finger at almost everybody else. Does it wash?
Well, look, I've read it. It's a very long article. It's actually something I'd recommend to everyone's reading. I still agree with Liz's diagnosis of the disease that's facing the country. And I think she accepts in this story that the prescription that we wrote, for which I have to, take part of the blame, wasn't delivered in the correct way. But I think her point of we need to lower taxes, we need to create a growing economy, that's what people want. People understand that they know better how to spend their money than the government does, and particularly people in the area we call the Red Wall, but places like the north of England, we have an economy stacked in favour of the South East, stacked in favour of the status quo and the establishment. And lots of people who voted Conservative in 2019 did it because they wanted the sort of disruption to the status quo that would create economic growth in the north.
But that disruption, some people would say that Liz Truss caused huge amounts of disruption, costs for people on their mortgage costs, meltdown in the money markets. Might it have been better if there was even a shred of regret or remorse about how it happened? I hear what you say about the economic diagnosis, but I think a lot of our viewers might just think, she brought this on herself. Shouldn't she be saying sorry? Didn't she
Well, I
sound
think there is
toned
an
down?
acceptance of culpability and liability. That's why I'd recommend that people, it hasn't been reported like that on the media, that's why I recommend that people read it. But I go back to that fundamental point, is that the reason people voted against the Labour Party at the last general election is because there is a feeling in the area I represent in Rosendale and Darwin that we have a government, whoever is in charge, who doesn't really understand the problems we face.
And you're talking about your own party, like you're the opposition.
No, but I think Liz understood that, and that's why I say I agree with her diagnosis, not necessarily with the cure.
We'll talk to Grant Shapps about that in a few minutes' time. But Liz Kendall, you're rolling your eyes and shaking your head while Jake was talking there. What did you make of how the way she's gone about this?
Well, less than 20 weeks since the Conservatives drove the economy off a cliff, Liz Truss is already back with no apology and no humility. And people whose mortgages rocketed and whose pensions plummeted will look on with, at best, shock and at worst, anger. And the problem for Rishi Sunak is he can't control any of this because he knows, as Jake has just said, that many people in the Tory party still agree with this. And when you look at a series of decisions that have been made, whether it's on onshore wind, whether it's on house building, Sunak is making decisions with always an eye to the right of the party, putting his party before what we need in the country. And that ultimately is the problem, because he will not be able to deliver the growth and change the country
Doesn't
needs.
she, though, just have a point about this sort of orthodoxy? And actually, some people on the left of the Labour Party think it's impossible to get the centre to move. Doesn't she have a point on that, briefly?
It's the markets that delivered the verdict on Liz Truss, not any kind of economic establishment. And that is the great irony. The person who claims, and the part of your party that claims to know markets, absolutely didn't. And that's because you simply cannot make unfunded promises.
OK, and
you
I think
need
we'll
to
get
say
more
where
into that later once we've
from.
heard from Grant Shapps. But Dame Kate Bingham, we'll talk to you about the vaccine and the health service a bit later. But briefly, a lot of this centres on the debate about whether the government's doing the right things for the economy. You know all about trying to get economic projects off the ground. Do they know what they're doing as things stand?
Well, I'm not going to make any strong political views, but as far as our industry is concerned, so development of new drugs, new vaccines, development, manufacturing and so on, I would say the government's relationship with industry at the moment is quite fragile. And I've said that before, and I think there are a lot of great things that we can do, but the relationship with how they work with innovative industries needs to improve.
OK, all three of you, more hard work for you later on, but stick with us for now. Now, of course, as ever, we want to hear what you think as well. As we go along, do email us at kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or if you're that way inclined, pick up your phone and use the hashtag on social media, BBC Laura K. The government has a whole long list of problems, high inflation, more health strikes coming along, huge pressure almost wherever Rishi Sunak looks, and don't even mention the polls. The government has plenty of challenges, but as we've been hearing, a new one this morning, the re-emergence of the former Prime Minister. Let's talk about that with Grant Shapps, who's the Business Secretary, who's come to the studio this morning. Welcome to you. You served briefly as Liz Truss's Home Secretary. There you are at the Cabinet table. I want to start off by asking you, Jake Berry's just essentially said Liz Truss was right. Do you agree?
So I think everybody actually agrees in the Conservative Party, and actually probably largely across the country. We don't want our taxes to be higher than they need to be to pay for all of our public services. We want to have an economy that's growing. I think, though, and here Jake is right, in her piece, Liz Truss does accept that actually you can't just go straight to those tax cuts without not only laying out the groundwork, that was her point. My point would be without dealing with the other things first. Inflation, first of all, getting growth into the economy, keeping debt under control.
Well,
I think you've got to get to those things first.
She does, Grant Shapps, say a bit about the communication should have been better. But she has a pretty stinging verdict, actually, on your whole party, saying the Conservatives failed for years to lay the groundwork, to make the right arguments. I mean, when you were sitting across the Cabinet table from her, Were you thinking, oh, hold on, we're getting this all a bit wrong, Liz, kind of slow down, put your seatbelts on, this might be the wrong way to go about it, or were you quite happy to go along with it?
Well, we'd already, at this stage, this is in the last 6 or 7 days of the government, we'd seen the impact on the markets. I wasn't part of her initial administration.
But did you agree with her vision? Because you took a job as Home Secretary. It's one of the biggest jobs in the government.
I thought actually at that point in time there was a moment of sort of almost national duty to be doing one of the most important roles in terms of the security of the nation, and very much took it on that. But I also sort of wished her luck. And your question is, in my heart, do I think we should have a lower tax economy? The answer, yes, absolutely.
No,
but
my question is, in your heart, do you think that Liz Truss's approach was the right one?
Well, clearly it wasn't. Clearly
it wasn't. And was she wrong then to write this morning that the Conservative Party has failed for years to make the right kind of arguments?
Well, I think she makes the perfectly valid point that somebody's obviously got to be agitating for and making the good arguments for the reasons why a lower tax economy in the longer run can be a very successful economy. And by the way, our overall level of tax is still lower than Germany. I think it's still lower than France, for example.
So but I also accept ever been in this country,
but I was going to say, I also accept it's very high, and we do want to see that reduced. I think you've got to set this within an international picture, which is Ukraine was invaded, energy prices went through the roof. We're in a situation, for example, where we're paying a third of people's energy bills, and that is unprecedented, right after the whole coronavirus thing. So we've had to spend vast fortunes, and of course taxes have had to rise.
And our viewers know that very well because they have bills arriving and money coming out of their bank accounts every single week. But my question is not about the pressures right now. It's on Liz Truss's point that your party successively, year after year, and you've served pretty much all the party leaders since the Tories have been in charge, has failed to make the arguments for the economy working in a different way, with lower tax, lower regulation. Is she right or wrong about that?
I think she's right about the need for a long-term lower tax, but I think it rubs up against the reality of 2 or 3 years of COVID and £400 billion cost of that, followed by a war and the enormous costs and pressures on energy and inflation.
But her point isn't really about that.
So,
her point is about whether somehow the Conservatives have lost their mooring. Have you moved too far to the left?
I'm trying to answer exactly that point by setting it in the international context that exists, by saying, whilst I agree with the desire to see a lower tax economy, I think first of all you have to put the building blocks in place. First of all, you've got to halve inflation, at least from where it is. You've got to grow the economy, and then you've got to deal with the longer term debt picture, which is nearly 100% of the economy now, right? Before you get on with the other priorities of people, like the NHS waiting list and the small boats. So there's lots of things you've got to do on the route to being able to have
But hold on, it's not just Liz Truss and Jake Berry in this studio, but even the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, have actually pointed to the high tax burden in this country as being one of the problems that this country faces, and one of the problems that they cite actually as a drag on growth. And when you hear from business groups or from Kate Bingham, a distinguished figure in the city, they kind of say you need a microscope to find a plan from this government to get the economy
just
going.
To be completely clear, because I think your description there might lead viewers to think that the IMF didn't think that, for example, what the Chancellor has done in his autumn statement was the right approach. They actually did think that was the right approach.
They did, but they have said recently that tighter fiscal and monetary policies and financial conditions mean that the economy will grow more slowly. And we're not going to argue about one definition or another, but you've got Jake Berry in this studio, Kate Bingham in this studio, Liz Truss in the Sunday Telegraph, telling you all that you have got the wrong approach towards the economy. Are they all wrong?
So I just want to pick you up on that again, I'm afraid, because that's not what the IMF is saying. They're acknowledging what we know to be true, which is exactly the point that Liz is making, that ultimately you don't want a high tax economy. It stifles growth and innovation, the thing that I'm most interested in as business secretary as we try to scale up Britain and grow the economy. On the other hand, the IMF, for example, absolutely agree that you've got to be able to pay for your plans, which is why they agree with Rishi's priority. If you remember, in the new year, the Prime Minister set out that getting debt under control was a very, very important medium-term goal. And so you've got to be responsible. That's innately Conservative. We look after people's money, and that is why it's very important that we follow this plan to, not only halve inflation, but get growth going and deal with the deficit.
But can you also deal with the point that's been made here in this studio that people around the country, as Jake Berry has said, look at the amount of tax that they're paying out. They don't believe necessarily, and the polls would bear this out, that what you're doing with the economy is the right recipe. You've made the case, we've had the discussion many times about why you want to tackle the sort of meltdown that there was in the autumn, and you've made that case. But right now, do you really think that people think you've got the right recipe when they're paying higher levels of tax than they've done for decades?
No one wants to pay higher levels of taxes, but I think you have to set this in an international context, that every Western government hit by Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine and experiencing the through-the-roof energy costs has then experienced high levels of inflation. People might watch this programme and kind of mistakenly think this is something happening in Britain and Britain alone. In fact, if you look at the international comparisons, it's happening around the world, and every government is struggling with this. And I don't want to make it sound like it's straightforward, because it's not. We're having to make those difficult choices. But are we making them in the national interest? Are we doing them in a way which is reasonable and trying to protect the most vulnerable? Yeah, absolutely.
And you believe that very strongly, and you've made that point. But I think some of our viewers might look at what's happening again in the Conservative Party and just think, why can't you just get on with each other?
Well, so I just would say that most people this morning are not getting up and discussing any of this around their breakfast table. Most people are getting on with... How do
you know?
Well, because actually, believe it or not...
The former Prime Minister says, and I think people have actually been very aware of the kind of political turmoil that your party has presided over.
Look, first of all, actually, one of the great things that I think has happened in the last 3 months is all of that has calmed down. We've got on with running the country. Any premium that was there in interest rates has dropped away through it by comparison internationally, and we've got on with the job. And actually, you know, Rishi's been on your programme, the Prime Minister's been on your programme. He set out his agenda to stop the small boats and deal with the NHS backlog and halve inflation. You've heard all of that. And actually, and the reason I say I don't think most people are talking about one article in a newspaper, but here's my bigger point. Politics is about debate. Why are we shy of it? Why do we, why would that be an issue or a concern? I actually welcome the idea that different colleagues have different ideas. I mean, that is the point of politics. We live in a democracy.
Well, the point of politics is also to get things done. And one of the things your government is trying to get done, they say, at the moment, is to sort out the strikes. Now, we've got the leader of the Unite Union, Sharon Graham. We'll be speaking to her in a few minutes. I think she's listening intently to what you say. The biggest health strikes to date are due this week. Why can't you just sort this out?
We really want to see these things resolved, and I actually also want to pay tribute, given we were just talking about the impact of coronavirus, to all of the work that went on in the NHS and elsewhere with public service workers. In fact, in the NHS, they were the only part of the public service that got a rise, pay rise
but
last year.
But let's talk about this week. Are you worried about what the impact might be on patients? I mean, your colleague, the Health Secretary, said that it could inflict harm.
I am concerned because what we've seen so far is a different approach taken by, for example, the Royal College of Nursing, who I think have been very responsible. We respect the right of people to withdraw their work, and the Royal College of Nurses have told us where that's going to take place so that the NHS has been able to make plans to keep people safe. Unfortunately, the ambulance unions haven't been prepared to tell us where the strikes are going to occur, to allow the army to provide the backup, and that has been putting people's lives at risk.
Well, they dispute that very strongly and say that's not how it works, and actually they've had deals that they've worked out in different parts of the country.
So the problem is they've only come up with those deals the night before, not leaving the army long enough to be able to position people, to be able to drive ambulances. If you have a stroke or a heart attack, and just because of your postcode, no ambulance can get to you because the unions would not agree in advance, as the nurses have done, to tell their employers where the strikes will be occurring. That's unfair, and that's why I'm introducing minimum safety levels and minimum service levels.
And that's legislation we've talked about on other occasions. But do you think strikes, as they will unfold this week in the health service, are morally wrong?
No, I think people have a right to strike, but I think people also have a right to life and limb, and livelihood, by the way, which is why minimum safety and service levels are so important, and why I'm so surprised that the opposition is voting against all of those measures.
But when can our viewers expect the government to sort this out? Because, you know, we've talked about this, it feels like almost every week for some months now.
Yeah.
And actually, when you speak to people privately in government, I hear often the suggestion that essentially nothing's going to change until we get to the budget, which is not now that far off. It's in the middle of March. Is that, as a reality check, the situation? We're going to have to tolerate strikes until then?
No, it really isn't. I don't think we need to be having these strikes at all. The reality is, as I said, actually over 1 million NHS workers got a pay rise last year when there wasn't one on offer. There's a pay rise on the table this year. And just to clarify one point, the government has actually, the system is agreed by the unions, asked for by the unions, that there's an independent pay review body that accepts evidence from the unions, from the management, and then they recommend a figure to the government. In every case, 5 separate cases, the government has entirely accepted the independent pay review body figure. So we've accepted the evidence and made that pay offer. I think it's very important that people know it's not the government trying to withhold money that's been proposed.
Well, sometimes those recommendations actually are increased by the government.
Well, there have been about 100 recommendations over, I think I'm right in saying, 20 years, and I think 5 have been rejected, several under the Labour government.
We'll see what happens in the next few weeks, but as things stand, these strikes are set to go ahead. Just briefly as we close, last night there was a dramatic development, a very sort of significant moment. The United States shot down a spy balloon that had appeared in the skies over Montana, I think. If that had happened over the UK, if there'd been a Chinese spy balloon here, would the UK have done the same? Would we have had the capability to do so?
Yeah, well, first of all, we fully support the US and the action they've taken. It cannot be right to send spy balloons floating over the mainland of the United States. And the UK would always take its national security very seriously. In a different realm to do with national security investments, I personally am responsible for judging whether Chinese and any other country is able to take over British firm, and where there is perhaps intelligence information, I do act and have acted.
And are you being tough enough on that? Because some of your backbenchers are concerned that actually on those kinds of decisions about stopping a Chinese firm perhaps investing in a crucial UK technology, for example, that you're not always being as tough as you ought to be.
Well, I've acted in a very high-profile case that is still under court review and have been extremely tough. On the other hand, we do want to be a country that's open for investment, but not in areas that might impact on our national security. And that is where we draw the line.
OK, it's a balance to strike. Grant Shapps, thank you very much indeed for being with us in the studio this morning. Well, there's a lot to digest there from that interview. Grant Shapps responding to Liz Truss's broadside at almost everyone in the Sunday Telegraph this morning. Let's speak to Jake Berry, who of course worked closely with her, who as the party chair. Jake, what did you make of what Grant Shapps had to say there? I mean, he disputed that the Tory party was wrong in the way that you claim.
Well, Laura, I think it was a moment of great agreement, which doesn't make for best TV on your show. But what I would say...
Steady on.
What I would say about Liz Truss's article is where I think actually she has got it wrong is this idea that we haven't seen the Conservative Party advocating growth and low taxes. We did see that from Boris Johnson. He was famous for his boosterism, and that led to the greatest general election victory for the Conservative Party this century.
Didn't lead to much growth in the economy, though.
But I think it is popular with the public to, well, of course, we had COVID immediately after the election, so there were a few limitations on what could be done, but it is popular with the public to be optimistic, to talk about the future of their family, to make sure that they keep more of their money in the first place. And actually, Rishi Sunak, in his 5 ambitions that he set out, partially set some of that out, saying, I'm going to create growth, I'm going to tackle inflation, that creeping stealth tax on every family in this country. I think, you know, if we can get back to those optimistic ways, it will unite the Conservative Party behind that low tax, high growth agenda. But the last time you were here, Jake Berry, you told our viewers that Rishi Sunak had 6 months to try and turn it around. How's he faring? Well, he's 100 days in. He's got several months left. No, I think he's made a good start. He's stabilised the economy. He's stabilised politics, really. It's all got very dull, but I think dull is good in this case. And he set out his 5 pledges that, you know, particularly I'm interested in the ones to create growth. Particularly I'm interested in how he's going to stop the small boats as one of his 5 pledges. And I think if he delivers on that, the British public will see he's a man who says what he is going to do and then gets on and does it. Liz Kendall, what did you make of what Grant Shapps had to say? Well, look, the reason why we have a high tax economy is we have a low growth economy, and we have seen at best anemic growth for under 13 years of this government, and nothing that we've seen from Jeremy Hunt is going to change that. We have a clear plan on growth. I think one of your former guests here, the chair of Tesco, said we were the only team on the pitch in terms of growth, whether that's on clean energy,
backing businesses and working in partnership, in an industrial strategy, or investing in the skills we need for the future. That is, you know, the unspoken thing in the room and in Grant Shapps' interview. And I think it actually leads back to what the discussion we're having on strikes and pay and the state of our public services. Because unless we grow the economy, we won't have the money to put into public services and deliver a pay deal for staff. And it's the public who are looking at 13 years of this government and saying, are we better off? Am I more likely to be able to see a GP or get an operation, get from A to B on the rail system, get good support in our schools? And the answer is no. And that's the problem for Rishi Sunak.
You know, you're putting profit before people. You know, unless you have a growing economy, I'm glad finally the Labour Party's woken up to this. I might point out that, of course, you stood at the last election on Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto, which would have completely trashed the economy. But the Labour Party repeatedly refers to the Conservatives put profit before people. We don't. We just understand that you cannot have fantastic public services without a growing economy, and that is what Rishi has set out.
I'm proud to say under Keir Starmer, we are absolute champions of British business. We are working in partnership with them, whether it's on green energy, whether it's on cutting business rates and putting in a new system and getting the skills that our businesses definitely need. And that is why people like the CBI say, look, we're losing the race on green energy when clean energy was ours to own. It's businesses who are saying they're not getting a deal.
Well, let's
a good
hear
deal
from someone in business. Kate, what did you make of what Grant Shapps had to say?
Well, I mean, the first thing is, in the private sector, it would be pretty unusual to have a lot of ex-CEOs hanging around judging what the current CEO is doing. So I think it is a very awkward position to have so many ex-leaders commenting and making, giving their thoughts. Yeah. I mean, obviously, we need a growing economy. There's no question about that. And again, as an investor, we need to have a place where we can attract investment into our businesses, into our small, growing, innovative companies.
And is the UK like that right now? Because in the Tory party, there are lots of people like Liz Truss and like Jake a little bit who think, you know what, not really. It's all a bit soggy centrist. It's all a bit Treasury orthodoxy. Does it look like a nimble, exciting place right now?
It has lots and lots of really good things. And I do accept that it's much more stable now as an economy than it has been. But we have to be more outward looking and more engaging with industry to actually be able to attract the investment we need.
OK, I just want to show our viewers these extraordinary pictures of the spy balloon that the US shot down overnight. We heard from Grant Shapps there that the UK is right behind the Americans taking that kind of action. But Kate, from a business point of view, is there anxiety about China and trying to take technology in a way that we should be worried about?
Well, we're very, very careful about protecting intellectual property. So that is fundamentally what we build in order to develop new drugs and new vaccines. And yes, I think we are concerned about losing our rights to be able to develop those sorts of innovative drugs. I mean, there are pretty strong laws in place, actually. CFIUS in the US and then the same over here. So preventing foreign states basically acquiring potentially important
OK, as
technology.
we've got you here and people know you from having spearheaded the vaccine task force, we want to have some positivity about the kind of solutions that might be out there for healthcare, because we've talked so much in the studio about things that are going wrong and all the challenges that are obviously very real. But can you tell us, I don't know, 2 or 3 exciting examples of approaches, new innovations that might make things better?
Yes, I mean, there's some really fantastic things. And I think the pandemic showed us how good we can be when we all actually work together. If I start with the Human Genome Project, genomics, the UK is a world leader in the understanding of genomics and how genetics drives disease, new tools to look at functional genomics. So if the more we can understand how aberrant biology causes disease, the more we can then start focusing on new drugs. And we're really good at that. And we've really got on data. So we've got DeepMind here, we've got plenty of AI analytics, machine learning capability, and again combined with the fact that we all have an NHS record, so that we've actually got population scale electronic health records. That's huge. So that then leads into what is the UK's ability to diagnose disease early and intervene quickly. Well, we are very well set up to do that. So if I just paint a picture, supposing you go in your middle age, you go into Boots and you get a blood test, and they say, well, your cholesterol's a bit high, you know, take a statin or don't eat so much cake.
A moment we all dread.
Yeah, exactly. And then, but alongside that, they then say with one of these new biopsies that are being developed. By the way, you've got some circulating cancer DNA, and we are now going to just give you an off-the-shelf cancer vaccine, just like a flu jab, to address that potential cancer that's not yet imageable. You can't see it, but we've detected it in the DNA. Now, that is something that can start to potentially treat disease way, way earlier than we currently do. And the more we can diagnose and identify disease earlier, the much better the outcome, which means we can be more economically productive. And the sorts of things we can do in the UK in our clinical trials and population scale, national scale, is beyond what any other country can do.
And I suppose the question really is do you think that the government or the opposition parties are really grasping those opportunities firmly enough?
Well, my view is not, and that's why I said I think we have a fragile relationship with industry, and we have to get, for example, advanced manufacturing sorted out. We've got to work with industry. In terms of pandemic resilience, the government signed up to a 100-day plan. You can't do that unless you work cooperatively with industry, and at the moment that's not happening.
So, Jake, why isn't that happening then? Because you've sat and told our viewers this morning that you've got to do the economy in a different way. The Conservatives have to be more interested in low tax and doing things, and they're not listening. Why not?
But I think one of the challenges that the government faces, in fact all government faces with the NHS, is the constant sort of lurching from crisis to crisis. And I think when you're dealing with record weights at A&E, actually we're seeing it across the globe, the international comparators show that it's everywhere. It's very hard to look forward into some of the brilliant things that Kate's suggesting. By the way, I think preventative medicine is exactly where the NHS should be going, and we do need to give more time and energy to it.
Kate.
But we've got an NHS which has a 1% productivity gain every year. We've had a massive setback during COVID, and we're probably set back 15 years plus. If you look at some of the data, it's more than that. And we are still projecting a 1% improvement in NHS productivity. So it's inadequate. There needs to be a complete reset.
Needs to be real reform.
Yeah.
Liz. The NHS needs investment and it needs reform. We've got to start with getting the workforce in place, which is why we've set out our plans for the biggest ever expansion of the NHS workforce, paid for by removing the non-dom tax status. But Kate is right. We need a shift to prevention. And I would argue that's not just about drugs. It's about using new technology so people can monitor long-term conditions at home. It's about joining up teams so people don't have to scrabble around a system. It really is about helping people prevent illness in the first place, get the treatments early on, but crucially, all of the debate is about hospitals. We need a huge focus on care in the community and at home. With the right staff, technology and data, we can do it. I know when I used to work for the ambulance service, we knew people who were calling 10, 20, 30 times a year, use that data, identify the person with the problem, put the right support in at home.
OK, we must leave that for now, but I did promise all of you when we went on air in September that we would bring you good, positive things to talk about as well as just tricky news, but something else that's exciting. If you're not going to be glued to Happy Valley tonight, we've got a bit of a recommendation for some other incredible television, some sadly real-life drama. If you missed the first episode of Putin versus the West, I thoroughly recommend you catch up on it and the rest of the series on the iPlayer. Here is a snapshot of episode 2, where Putin turns his attention to the Middle East.
As the uprisings of the Arab Spring tear through the Middle East, the West tries to enlist Putin as peacemaker.
Having been an irrelevant factor in the Middle East for so long, suddenly the Russians are back.
But the Russian president, exploiting the West's inaction, shows just how far he's willing to go to keep his allies in power.
Putin doesn't care about the loss of life. He doesn't care about the damage he inflicts. He doesn't care about what he does to civilians.
Now, tomorrow, nurses will walk out again in England, and they'll be joined by many other NHS workers in what will be the biggest strike in the history of the health service. In Wales, though, there's been a glimmer of a deal and the strike has been put on pause. So what's really going on? We can talk to the leader of the Unite Union, which represents many of the NHS staff, Sharon Graham, who's in Cardiff, where there have been talks this weekend. Thanks so much for being with us this morning, Sharon.
Thank you.
I want to put to you, first of all, what is going on in Wales? There are some unions that have paused the strikes. Why won't you do the same?
Well, look, I'm in Wales and I have been all weekend trying to get to the deal that we need to give to our members to solve the dispute. We're not there yet. The reality is we are not there yet. What we needs to happen now is for Wales to come back to the table, which I'm meeting the Health Minister later on today, in order for us to see if we can get a deal. But I think the important thing, Laura, to say is it's in stark contrast, Scotland and Wales, to what is happening in England. And I've just heard the interview with Grant Shapps. It's the eve of the biggest NHS strike in our history, and he has absolutely nothing to say about it. Where is Rishi Sunak? Why is he not at the negotiating table? That's where he should be, and that's what we're calling on him to do.
He did have something to say, though, to our viewers. He said that you are putting lives at risk and patients will be harmed by your decision to walk out.
Well, this government is putting lives at risk. And let me just give you a stat. 500 people are dying every single week. 500 waiting for an ambulance. So what we're trying to do is that we are trying to, yes, get pay, of course, because we need to solve the workforce crisis, but we're also trying to make sure that patients are much safer than what they are. It's almost like there's a strike in the NHS every single day. We've got 130,000 vacancies. So we're doing our very best to try and solve this dispute, but it's going to take more than that. It's going to take investment in the NHS also.
The NHS in England, though, does actually dispute that figure, just to make that clear to our viewers. But isn't the state of play and just how desperate and sometimes dangerous things are, isn't that exactly the reason why walking out is actually going to put patients in even more peril?
Well, actually, again, listening to Grant Shapps, I mean, I haven't used this word so much about politicians, I don't think, ever in 30 years, but he's actually lying. The idea that he is saying that ambulance workers did not do minimum cover in the dispute is an absolute, utter lie. And it's important that we rectify that this morning. That is not true. What we are doing is that we, of course, are making things as safe as possible. And you can look at our stats to show that that has happened. But on a daily basis, this government is putting people's lives at risk. We've got 500 people dying in a single week just waiting for ambulances, and that's outside other pieces. They need to come to the table. Where is Rishi Sunak? This is either because this man is out of his depth, he doesn't know what he's doing, or there's a much more sinister reason as to why they are doing this to the NHS.
But Sharon Graham, I'm sure Grant Shapps, who's not now here to respond to your claim that he's actually lying about what's going on, but that's a very serious charge. But I just want to say to you, our viewers this morning will have heard Grant Shapps being disparaging about the unions. They'll now hear you being disparaging about the government. Surely both sides could do the public a favour, cool things down and sort it out. What are you doing to actually try and make that happen?
Well, look, it's really difficult. Laura, in 30 years of negotiating, I've never seen such an abdication of responsibility in my entire life. Rishi Sunak is the CEO of UK PLC. We are trying to sit down with him and do a negotiation. It's very difficult to do a negotiation to solve a dispute like this if they won't even come to the table. They won't even come to the table. We've wrote to them, we've asked them to say, come to the table. We are willing to look at solutions in relation to this.
So
the money is there.
Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, has said that there is dialogue going on. Is he not telling the truth?
He's not telling the truth, Laura. I can tell you categorically that there has been no conversations on pay whatsoever with Rishi Sunak or Stephen Barclay about this dispute in any way, shape or form. They've danced around their handbag, danced around the edges, but they will not talk about pay. And to me, that is an abdication of responsibility. The dispute is about pay. So how can they say they're in talks? Talks about what? What are they in talks about?
But are there talks at other levels? Sharon Graham, are there other talks at other levels with other ministers or government officials? Or are you telling our audience this morning that on the eve of the biggest health strike in history, there is zero conversation between anyone in your union and anyone at all speaking for the government?
I can absolutely categorically tell you that. I had the General Secretaries in a conversation with me last week. In fact, we were watching your programme one morning thinking, have we all missed an email? What talks are they talking about? I can categorically say to you, we are in no talks at any level whatsoever with the government about pay in the NHS. And that is a real abdication of responsibility. Why is Rishi Sunak not coming to the table? Instead of doing, sort of press sort of conferences about other things, come and negotiate. Roll your sleeves up and negotiate on the pay in the NHS. That's what's required.
OK, we'll see what happens in the coming days and whether there is anything in the very last minute that could stop these strikes happening. But it doesn't sound like it from listening to you and Grant Shapps this morning. Let's talk about the Labour Party. Now, our viewers who might not be familiar with union relations, your union Unite is the biggest and has an official tie and affiliation with the Labour Party. But in July, you said there's no point giving money to a party that is basically sticking two fingers up to workers. It's almost like an abusive relationship. Now, that's very strong language. Do you still feel that way?
Well, look, what I'd say to you, Laura, is that obviously I would prefer a Labour government. Of course I would. They will do better on workers. We would not have some of the things going on. I believe they would be at the table negotiating on pay. So that is really clear. But it is OK also to be critical. And I do think that Labour needs to come out and say that they would make different choices. Make choices on these profiteering companies. We cannot put this country through austerity Mark II again. Why is it OK to say to workers to take the pay of the crisis, but it's not OK to say that profiteering companies should pay for the crisis? And what I want Labour to do is to clearly say they choose that direction rather than plummeting us again into a lighter austerity.
And when you hear Rachel Reeves or Keir Starmer in this chair next to me say things like, we may not be able to do good Labour things as quickly as we would like, do you interpret that as what you described as austerity light?
Well, look, what I'd say, and I've said this figure to Keir Starmer and I've said it before, is that if you take energy, there's £170 billion of excess profit from the leaked Treasury report, excess profit in energy. Why can't we have 50 billion of that and effectively deal with the black hole if it's there, the 40 billion? You'd have 6 billion to give every NHS worker 10% pay rise, and you'd have money left over. Why is that choice so abhorrent? Why is that not the choice that you would take? But you'd rather take the choice of saying that actually everyone's going to have to pull in their belts. It's totally unacceptable for workers and communities in this country to pay for this crisis whilst there's rampant profiteering going on.
I know you've said very carefully you would prepare a Labour government. You were very clear about that. But you do sound frustrated with the Labour leadership's stance and the repeated occasions on which they say, oh, we won't write big cheques, we'll be very, very careful with the public finances. I mean, are you frustrated, and do you still believe that their choices suggest they are, to use your phrase, sticking two fingers up to workers?
Well, look, I think it's really important that the workers' voice is heard. I'm going to make sure that I use every breath that I have to make sure that we have the workers' voice heard. Labour is in Parliament to be the workers' voice in Parliament, and I want them to use that voice in a much louder way than they are. I do think this word of choices is very important. In 2023, the big question is going to be who pays? Who pays for this crisis? And at the moment, I don't see anyone saying that it shouldn't be workers and communities. All I'm hearing is that it should be, we've got to tighten our belts and people have got to be careful, etc. Why is that allowed to happen when you've got rampant profiteering going on, which, by the way, is attributed to inflation? Why can't the choice be that we look at those profiteering organisations and we ask them to pay their bit in a much more detailed way than what we've been?
And briefly, there's another choice for the Labour Party, Sharon, and we don't have much time, but I just wonder if I can ask you very quickly. There's another voice on the left, Jeremy Corbyn, the former Labour leader. He still wants to stand as a Labour candidate in his current seat. The party at the moment is saying that he shouldn't stand. Should he be allowed to run as a Labour MP? Would you like to see that?
Well, look, Jeremy Corbyn is a Labour MP. The party has gone through an investigation in inverted commas. It's clear he's a Labour MP. And, of course, I think that if he stood in his constituency, he'd win, actually. I think he probably would win in relation to that. So rather than creating barriers, why don't we try and bring people together? But whether it's Jeremy Corbyn or Keir Starmer or somebody else, the key thing here now for this country is who pays for this crisis. And unless we get some different choices, it will be workers who pay again.
OK, Sharon Graham, thank you so much for coming on the programme from Cardiff. It's great to have you with us, and I hope you come back for more conversations soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Now from Cardiff to Liverpool, where preparations are getting going for one of the biggest stages in the world, Eurovision, of course, which the UK is hosting on behalf of Ukraine, who won last year. We can show you the stage, which is meant to represent a huge hug to show the open arms from Europe to Ukraine. the country that's been hit so hard by conflict. So we wanted to see how people in Ukraine feel watching what's going on in Liverpool from afar. Timur Miroshenko is the country's Eurovision presenter, their equivalent of Graham Norton. And I asked him what it all meant to him in these difficult times.
It's not about music. It's better to say not only about music, because it has a lot of different values, equality, diversity, and so on, so on, so on. And it's not the empty words. It's true. And last year's Eurovision 2022, I think showed it to the whole world that it's not just an empty words, because you know that Eurovision was invented almost 70 years ago, just to unite all the nations around the peace after the Second World War. And last year and this year, in this, I think, darkest times of in US history, not only of Ukraine, but all the continent and the whole world, Eurovision has proved all these values last year.
Are you ready to have a good time?
Eurovision is music, love, and diversity.
What did Ukraine winning last year mean for you?
I know that millions and millions of Ukrainians, not only in Ukraine, but abroad, they just sit in front of TV sets, maybe not at their homes because they had to flee their homes, but they've been sitting in front of TV sets and just crying. Even me in commentary booths.
You've been on air, well, under the threat of bombardment. Can you tell us what that was like?
We had to go underground to do our job. All of our channels have right now additional studios in the bunkers.
Have you done other projects to help people on the front line?
Sure, all of us volunteering all the time from the first days. I've made maybe 50 or 60,000 kilometers by car, moving some stuff for military, some humanitarian aid.
And have you been to the front line with that kind of help?
Yeah, a couple of times with the concerts for military. Tomorrow I go into front line once again, maybe not on the front line, but to the hospital near the front line with a charity concert for military, just to raise their morale, to show them that we are together with them.
What was that like?
It's the best events, I think, because our military have so great morale, and we charging from them, really charging from them, because they know better what's the price of life.
There it is. Eurovision is officially in Liverpool.
And Liverpool's a very vibrant city with a proud history of music. Do you think Ukrainians have anything in common with Scousers?
I think yes. During my visit to Liverpool, I've been thinking that Liverpool reminds me of Mariupol. Of course, Mariupol, much younger city than Liverpool, but it's at the same time, it's a port city. It's a very musical city because there we had a lot of different musical festivals on the seashore, and it was very painful to see that at that time Mariupol were destroyed by a Russian army, and I don't know how many times we need to rebuild this city, but we definitely will. And of course, I hope that as sometime we will have an opportunity to invite all the people to Mariupol. Maybe Mariupol and Liverpool gonna be some brother cities.
Last, how about coming back and being our special Eurovision correspondent?
Yeah, deal.
Excellent, it's a deal. Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us, and take care of yourself.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And we will keep checking in as we approach the big event in May. Now, since Christmas, we've heard from Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer and Nicola Sturgeon. And now it's the Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Ed Davey's turn. Welcome to the studio. It's good to have you here. Now, you're setting out a big new idea today, promising that care workers would be paid an extra £2 on top of the minimum wage. Sounds like the kind of idea everyone would think, oh, I like the sound of that, but how would you pay for it?
Well, first of all, when I go and talk to people on the doorstep, the big issue is the NHS crisis. And no one thinks there's a silver bullet, a quick fix. But our policy to increase the minimum wage for carers, an extra £2 an hour, will deal with one of the big problems, namely that we don't have enough carers. 165,000 vacancies in social care, and if we get those care workers by paying them decently, then we can ensure that people can be discharged from hospital and deal with the waiting list, and we would pay for it through asking the gambling industry to pay more tax. We've set out that problem, and the real issue is the gambling industry poses costs on the health service, and we think they should pay their fair share.
So a sort of extra sin tax, but that doesn't sound very liberal, does it?
I think it's very liberal. The truth is that the gambling industry, according to Public Health England, are causing mental and physical health problems, posing a charge to our NHS. And I think it's therefore quite a good idea to ask them to pay more so we can pay the carers more. And this £2 an hour extra for carers would make a big difference. If we can recruit more carers, if we can retain more carers, that's the way to solve the health crisis. And this is the point we're making. You can't sort the crisis in the NHS unless you sort out the social care crisis.
And how would you actually make it happen though? Because lots of care workers, and plenty watching this morning and their families, lots of care workers work for private companies. They don't always work for local councils, and local councils might think, well, how are you going to force us to do that? Would you pass a law? Would you have a special carers wage, or how would it actually work? Would you force people to pay extra?
It would be mandatory. It would be a legal requirement that employers of care workers would pay them at least this extra £2 an hour on top of the national minimum wage. So it would be a legal requirement.
But lots of other workers, maybe nursery nurses or some teaching assistants and other people in important jobs who are paid the minimum wage, they might think, well, why are care workers special? Why don't you just increase the minimum wage for everybody? Why just pick on one profession? Is that fair?
Well, the real crisis facing our country at the moment is in the NHS. And people are deeply worried that they're not getting the operations when they want them. There's huge waiting lists. There's
but there are
problems
shortages
at
of staff almost right across the public sector. So why pick out one industry?
Well, there's a shortage of staff across the whole country in the private sector and the public sector. That is right. But when we have an NHS on its knees because there aren't enough care workers, and when we can't discharge enough people quick enough, only 2 in 5 people leave hospital when they're able to leave hospital. The rest are kept in hospital because there are no care beds in care homes. There's no care workers to be able to look at people after people when they get home. So this is a policy which is targeted at dealing with not just treating care workers properly, but also the NHS. I've been a carer most of my life, looking after my mother when I was young, then my grandmother, and now with my wife, my son. And so I know how family carers are not valued enough in our country. But I also know the importance of professional carers. I mean, we need, in my family and in millions of families across the country, we need these social care workers. They've never been valued enough. And when I became leader of the Liberal Democrats, I said I wanted to be a voice of carers, whether they're unpaid family carers or these professional carers. And this new policy is making good on that promise.
Well, we know how much our viewers and people watching this morning care about this issue, so it's interesting to hear you talk about it. Let's have a look at something else that's been happening since you've been the leader. Let's take a look at the polls and what has been going on, and I think we can show our viewers what has been happening. There it is. That's a tracker poll. So the Conservatives there in blue, Labour in red, the SNP in yellow, and the orange of the Liberal Democrats. Now, when you look at that, which is 2020 up to right now, what does that tell you, Ed Davey?
What I look at is the votes in real elections. And the last 18 months have been really successful for the Liberal Democrats. You recall we've had 3 major parliamentary victories.
But you know the
Conservatives.
national polls matter, and you know that they matter very significantly. And if we look at the numbers, it shows that the Tories have crashed down because of all the turmoil. It shows a very significant switch to the Labour Party that right now looks like it's sustained. And it looks like you've been bumping a lot at the bottom and you've missed that opportunity.
But Laura, the thing I care most about is the actual votes in ballot boxes. So it's not only the 3 by-election victories in Tory heartlands where we're the ones who beat the Conservatives, and I think in all the blue wall seats where the Tories are very vulnerable, it'll be the Liberal Democrats who are the main opposition.
But are you sitting here this morning and telling me that as a national Westminster leader, you're not bothered about bumping along at 9 or 10% when there's been, you know, sort of meltdown in one of our big parties, and you've not been nationally picking up from that opportunity?
Again, let me
and
refer
you know that your party couldn't, from a resourcing point of view, couldn't run the equivalent of by-election campaigns right across the country when it comes to the general election.
Let me give you an example where there were elections across the whole United Kingdom and we won those elections. Last May, there were local elections in Wales, Scotland and England, and we had more gains than any other political party. And we weren't able to concentrate resources across the country. So that shows the Liberal Democrats really making huge progress.
OK, well, there are May elections coming, not that too far off. Ed Davey, thank you very much for coming in this morning. It's great to have you here. Right, it's nearly 10 o'clock. As ever, it has zipped by. And as Liz Truss returns to the scene, we started this morning by asking, why can't the Conservative Party just get along? Here's Grant Shapps.
We've got on with running the country. Any premium that was there in interest rates has dropped away by comparison internationally, and we've got on with the job. And actually, you know, Rishi's been on your programme, the Prime Minister's been on your programme. He's set out his agenda to stop the small boats and deal with the NHS backlog and halve inflation.
Right, let's have a final word with our panel. Liz Kendall, we heard from Sharon Graham. She sounds pretty frustrated that the Labour Party isn't representing workers properly.
She said that her members would be better off under a Labour government. And, you know, I disagree.
She was frustrated. She said she's frustrated by the choices
with what she said about the choices.
Making.
Look, we are the party that led the charge for a windfall tax on the energy companies to help people with the cost of living crisis, including Unite members. We have said that we will get rid of the non-dom tax status, put that money into the biggest ever expansion of the NHS workforce and guarantee breakfast clubs for every primary school children that would also benefit her members. You know, Sharon is rightly doing her job, standing up and fighting for her members. But our job is to get a Labour government, deliver for the people who use public services, for the staff that work in them, but also, crucially, taxpayers. So we will not make unfunded...
Should Jeremy Corbyn be able to be a Labour MP, as she suggested?
He hasn't apologised for what happened over anti-Semitism, so no.
Jake Berry, just a last word to you. Why can't your party just get along better with each other?
Well, I think we're seeing it coming together behind Rishi. He's got his 5 pledges. I am 100% behind them. But as Grant said, we are having an active debate about the future of tax policy in this country. It's interesting to hear from Liz. It's the same old Labour Party, isn't it? What are you going to do? We're going to put up taxes on energy companies. We're going to abolish tax non-dom status. But all of it is just we are going to increase taxes and spend more money. And in fact, we are the party that's going to grow the economy to pay for those public services.
Liz, I know you know your links with the unions are often sort of fractious between the Labour Party and the unions, but you know the government's position is that unions are putting people's lives at risk, and you know Grant Shapps and Downing Street say that what Sharon Graham said about them lying about what was going on with ambulance provision is not true. We're happy to put that cause. Liz Kendall.
Please don't call me Liz Truss.
Liz Kendall,
Please.
can you just briefly address that point?
Look, it is the government's responsibility. They can sort this. You know, the unions have said even before this started at Christmas, if you meet us to discuss pay, we'll call this off.
Okay.
We have seen when proper negotiations take place about pay, not everything else, they can stop it. It lies at the government's door.
And Kate Bingham, you're a big boss. One sentence, what would your advice be for sorting it out? Crack their heads together?
I would focus hard on innovation. If you look at Europe, they have 50% more innovative drugs than we have here in the UK.
OK, we must stop. We're always against the clock. A huge thank you to our panel who helped us chew everything over this morning as we pondered why the Tories sometimes find it hard to get along. This morning, Jake Berry told us there's a feeling in the area he represents that the government, whoever's in charge, doesn't really understand people's problems. More than a decade in power has given the Tories plenty of time for grudges and resentments to build up, that's for sure. But maybe a pair of former Prime Ministers courting attention doesn't help the new Prime Minister either. Whether you think Liz Truss should have kept her counsel or want more of that kind of red meat, her arrival back on the scene is sure to spark even more argument about what the Conservative Party is really for. Please do catch up on anything you missed this morning on iPlayer. And if you're a fan, I hope you enjoy the Happy Valley finale tonight. But for now, goodbye.
That's honestly, Tories. I honestly sometimes don't know why she was fucking mad shit. It's like living on another planet. Like, the way the Tories bang on about Labour is hilarious. Yo, breaking news. They haven't been in power for 13 years. You have. They talk about taxes being high and all that shit. You put them high. With your batshit crazy economic theory. Honestly, they gave us austerity. We was the only country after the crash that did austerity. Only country. Under the fucking Tories. Useless fucking twats, honestly. Can't believe it. And then they give us Liz Truss. It's like saying, oh, well, Jeremy Corbyn was the Labour leader. Yeah. He wasn't the Prime Minister though, was he? You fucking idiots. He wasn't in power. You was. Crashed the economy, you dumb fucking cunts. Not to say to these fucking people anymore. Get them out. You make Thatcher seem tame, and that's mental. Anywho, be back tomorrow.